The first truly free breath Anna took was in the damp, sterile air of a lawyer's waiting room, 3 days after she had finally said the word, divorce. It tasted of metal and forgotten history, but to her, it was the purest air on earth. For 15 years, her lungs had forgotten how to expand fully, compressed by the suffocating weight of a silence so dense it felt like lead, a silence cultivated by her husband Klaus. Klaus was a German man who carried the year of his birth, 1944, like a heavy, invisible suit of armor. He was not old enough to have fought the war, but he was old enough to be born into its smoking ruins, into the deep, collective and entirely unspoken shame of its aftermath. He was part of the generation that learned to be quiet. His father, a man who returned from the Eastern Front only to disappear into his workbench, had modeled a profound taciturnity that Klaus mastered and elevated into an art form. Words were liabilities, emotions were sloppiness. Everything had to be efficient, organized, and above all controlled. He was a complicated soul forged in austerity. Anna, who was 31 when she met the 46-year-old Klaus, hailed from the vibrant, sun-drenched chaos of South America. She carried this heritage in her nature, light-hearted, quick to smile, and instinctively warm. Physically, she was of medium height, with a dynamic, expressive energy that seemed to shimmer around her, a vivid counterpoint to his severe stillness. She was working as a freelance German to English translator, drawn, paradoxically, to the structured quiet of the German language. She saw him first at a classical concert in Munich, a tall, immaculately dressed man in a charcoal suit. Klaus was lean, almost aggressively straight-backed, reflecting the control he valued. He moved with the stiffness of a man constantly holding himself in check. He had close-cropped silvering hair and eyes the precise color of Baltic amber, perpetually observing, but never engaging. He wasn't handsome in the soft, easy way of the men her own age. He was handsome in the severe, architectural way of a brutalist building, strong, imposing, and deliberately difficult to penetrate. What drew her, she would later spend thousands of hours agonizing over, was the promise of substance beneath the silence. Her own childhood had been chaotic and loud, filled with easy sentimentality that evaporated quickly. Klaus offered permanence. His deliberate manner, his precise judgments, his refusal to engage in small talk. She mistook it for intellectual depth and moral fortitude. She saw him as a solid anchor in a shifting world, a bedrock of stability. In the beginning, Klaus's approach was deceptively gentle and intensely focused. He treated their early dates, Tuesday dinners at the same traditional restaurant, Thursday nights for the opera or a gallery, and long Sunday walks in the Englischer Garten, with a meticulous scheduling that Anna initially found endearing. He was not overtly affectionate, but his devotion was expressed through an attentive presence, a soft, rare smile reserved just for her, and deep, searching compliments that felt profoundly loving. "Your spirit, Anna, is a light," he once told her in a low voice. "It cuts through the grayness I inhabit." This initial charm, the gentle intensity, was what captured her, feeding the belief that he truly understood and cherished her unique qualities. Soon after she moved in, however, the gentleness began to dissipate, replaced by the rigidity she would come to know so well. The soft smile vanished. He reverted to speaking only to deliver pronouncements on art, history, or the lamentable state of German engineering compared to 2 decades prior. He never asked about her feelings, her dreams, or her fears. He asked about her work with the cold precision of a quality control inspector, and the compliments ceased entirely. And Anna, starved for seriousness, loved it. She felt chosen by his stringent criteria. She felt she had passed an exacting test. He proposed with the same efficient lack of fanfare. "We should marry," he stated one Tuesday, after finishing his Sauerbraten. "It is the logical next step. You manage the domestic affairs well, and I require stability for my work." Anna's heart, foolish and young, soared. Stability, requirement, logical. These were the strongest declarations of love she had ever heard. The wedding was small, flawless, and completely joyless. Every detail was planned by Klaus and executed by Anna under his relentless supervision. "The flowers clash with the stone, Anna. This is a 5-star location, not a country fair. he'd said about her choice of hydrangeas. Her simple white dress was deemed adequate. The first few years of marriage were defined by a slow, creeping realization. The depth she admired was, in fact, merely surface. The intellectual acuity was a shield, and the quiet fortitude was absolute emotional barrenness. The quiet, which had once seemed like solid gold, began to feel like the vacuum of space. She realized that Klaus didn't remain silent because his thoughts were too profound for words. He remained silent because he had no interest in her thoughts, and his own were only concerned with reinforcing his own self-image. This was the beginning of the control. It started benignly, subtly. Her choice of art for the living room was too colorful and distracting. Her cooking was acceptable, but you overuse cumin. Her friends were shallows and her family was loud and financially irresponsible. His criticism was not delivered with anger, but with the flat, clinical tone of someone correcting a mathematical error. "Anna," he'd say, standing over her while she read a novel, "you are spending an unquantifiable amount of time on trivial narratives. You should be using this time to organize the accounts, or perhaps to learn Italian, which is a useful skill." She started hiding her books. She stopped inviting friends over. She changed her entire wardrobe to muted tones of beige, grey, and navy, the only colors Klaus deemed serious, trying to physically subdue the expressive energy he had once fleetingly found attractive. She had traded chaos for order, and the order was slowly consuming her identity. She had fallen in love with a mask, and now she was married to the face beneath it, a complicated soul, yes, but complicated by a deep, protective shield of narcissistic personality disorder. He didn't just need to be right, he needed her to be wrong, lesser, perpetually off balance, so that his own fragile, war-born ego could stand tall in the center of their tiny universe. He required not affection, but perpetual, unquestioning admiration, and his method for obtaining it was constant, quiet belittling. The cage didn't have bars. It had rules, and the rules were fluid, always shifting, always designed to make Klaus the center of gravity and Anna the satellite, perpetually adjusting her orbit to his needs. He saw his life, and by extension, their shared life, as a beautifully designed machine, and Anna was an essential but often malfunctioning component. His NPD wasn't characterized by grand, theatrical outbursts. It was the quiet, relentless drip of disdain, the systematic erosion of her self-worth. It was the absolute lack of empathy, dressed up as superior intellect. "You look tired, Anna. Are you managing your schedule effectively?" was his preferred morning greeting. It sounded like concern, but it was an immediate interrogation of her competence. If she tried to share a small triumph from her translation work, a difficult idiom resolved, a tricky deadline met, he would nod once, his amber eyes already distant. "Yes, well, that is what you are paid to do. It is important that you maintain quality, of course. I just noticed the lawn is growing unevenly. Did you contact the gardener as I instructed?" The conversation, and her moment of pride, was dismissed, replaced instantly by one of his concerns which were, by definition, more important. He never truly listened. He only waited for his turn to speak, or more often to direct. The most difficult part was the gaslighting, though she didn't have the language for it then. If she finally gathered the courage to confront him, "Klaus, when you told me I was financially reckless because I bought a new sweater, it made me feel worthless." He would regard her with an expression of weary, intellectual pity. "Anna, I am merely providing objective commentary based on budgetary facts. Your emotional response is an overreaction and frankly melodramatic. I did not call you worthless. That is your own internal narrative. You must learn to distinguish between my helpful critique and your hypersensitivity." She would walk away from these encounters feeling dizzy, her reality blurred. Was I being dramatic? Was he just trying to help? The man who never raised his voice, who never broke a plate, who kept their finances immaculate, could not possibly be the villain her heart sometimes whispered he was. He was just German. He was just precise. He was just damaged by the war. She kept inventing excuses, wrapping his cruelty in the blanket of historical trauma. She was trapped in the loop of trying to understand him, while he was merely trying to manage her. Their home, a spacious, minimalist apartment with expensive German fittings, became a mausoleum of quiet desperation. Anna spent her days navigating a psychological minefield. She meticulously organized the spice rack alphabetically, because Klaus had once glanced at it and raised a single critical eyebrow. She planned meals weeks in advance, ensuring no recipe repeated itself too soon, and that no ingredient was outside his narrow, healthy approval zone. She became a brilliant actress, performing the role of the capable, serene German wife, while inside, the real Anna was screaming, bound and gagged. Years turned into a decade. She stopped inviting anyone over entirely. Klaus was an engineer, and his colleagues were either terrified of him or mirrored his cold detachment. Her own network of friends withered from neglect, tired of the excuses Anna made for Klaus's rudeness or his habit of reading the newspaper silently during a dinner party. They stopped calling, sensing the impenetrable barrier she had erected, a barrier made of his control and her exhaustion. She felt the slow physical decline of her own spirit. She developed a nervous tic in her eyelid. She suffered from insomnia, lying awake beside Klaus, whose sleep was deep and undisturbed. The sleep of a man utterly convinced of his own perfection, a man with no conscience to trouble him. One evening she saw herself in the polished reflection of the kitchen cabinet, a pale woman with shadows under her eyes, wearing a shapeless taupe sweater, cleaning a tiny smudge off the glass countertop with a dedicated cloth. She paused. Who was this person? She used to be vibrant, full of curiosity, a lover of loud jazz and strong coffee. Now she was a quiet, cleaning automaton whose only discernible characteristic was compliance. The epiphany wasn't dramatic, it was surgical. It came during a business trip of Klaus's, a rare 5-day window of solitude. On the 3rd day she woke up, and the apartment was silent, but for the sound of birds outside. She made a decision. She would not clean. She would not organize. She would just be. She would allow a small, controlled amount of disorder to exist in his perfect, empty space. She put on a bright red dress she had kept hidden in the back of her closet for years. It was inappropriate, it was frivolous, it had color. She bought a cheap vinyl record of New Orleans jazz, loud, brassy, joyously chaotic, and put it on. The noise felt obscene in Klaus's temple of order. She sat in the middle of the expensive, minimalist living room, the music echoing off the stark walls, and she wept. She wept for the girl she had been, for the woman she had lost, and for the 15 years spent prioritizing a man who had zero emotional capacity for anyone but himself. She noticed a stack of magazines Klaus had left on the coffee table, an absolute breach of his own rules. She opened the top one. It was a trade journal for advanced engineering, full of his highlighted notes. In the margin, scrawled next to an article about sustainable architecture, was a note in his precise, severe handwriting. It read, "A is too passive, needs direction." He was grading her like a construction project. He saw her passivity, the very compliance he demanded and ruthlessly enforced, and critiqued it as a flaw that required more of his direction. He was complaining that his robot wasn't working independently, yet he had destroyed the programmer. That moment, that casual, cruel dismissal written on the side of a technical journal, was the fracture. It wasn't about love or hate, it was about survival. He wasn't going to get better, he wasn't going to change. She would spend the rest of her life shrinking until she vanished entirely. She had to choose between his life and her own. When Klaus returned from Frankfurt, the jazz record was still on the turntable, and Anna was sitting on the sofa, not cleaning. The moment he walked in, he stopped, his body going rigid. The disorder he perceived was a physical assault on his reality. He didn't ask about her trip. He didn't ask about her health. He simply pointed, his finger, a rigid, unbending weapon, at the bright red cover of the jazz album. "Anna, what is that noise? And why is this?" He gestured to the record and her red dress with vague, disgusted movements. "So unprofessional, it disturbs the equilibrium." She looked him straight in the eyes, a thing she hadn't done truly in years, and felt a strange, cold calm descend. It was the calm of the condemned. "It is music, Klaus, and I am wearing red because I like it." He waited, expecting the immediate correction, the apology, the scurry to restore order. When none came, The usual analytical pity dissolved into a flash of pure, cold rage, instantly controlled and rerouted into contempt. "Do not be ridiculous. You are an adult. This is not how we conduct ourselves. You have obligations here. You are embarrassing yourself." "I am leaving you, Klaus." The words were so small, but the silence that followed swallowed them whole. He didn't blink. He simply processed the data. "Do not be foolish," he said finally, his voice dangerously low, almost bored. "You are completely reliant on me. You have no savings, your work is inconsistent, and your emotional stability is questionable. Where will you go? This is merely a tantrum, Anna. Go and put on something sensible. We will discuss your lack of fiscal planning later." And this, she realized, was the final defining quality of his narcissism, the utter bedrock certainty that she was nothing without him. He genuinely believed he was the pillar holding up her world. "I will go anywhere I can breathe," she replied. The next year was a living hell. Klaus, whose persona of meticulous control cracked open to reveal a core of bottomless entitlement, treated the divorce like a business-hostile takeover. He used his legal team, his financial knowledge, and his sheer exhausting pedantry to drag out every single motion. His goal was not fairness, but attrition. He wanted her to crumble, to beg for his generous, controlling return. He refused to move out, claiming that he was the stable party and that she was too erratic to handle a property transfer. Every evening was an exercise in passive-aggressive warfare. He would leave microscopic notes criticizing her packing. The choice of box for the kitchen implements demonstrates a lack of foresight regarding density and weight distribution. He would sigh dramatically when she made coffee, claiming the aroma of her brand was disruptive to my evening digestions. He weaponized his own suffering. He told friends and, worse, her remaining few acquaintances, that Anna had become unwell and that he was bearing the burden of her mental collapse with quiet German stoicism. He was the victim, the long-suffering husband whose life was being ruined by the sudden, inexplicable capriciousness of a lesser mind. Anna, in her desperation, did exactly what he didn't expect. She retreated physically but stood firm emotionally. She secured a small temporary apartment on the outskirts of the city, a place so insignificant Klaus wouldn't bother to find it. She liquidated a small, forgotten inheritance from an aunt, money she was always told was irresponsible to touch, and hired a tough, pragmatic female lawyer who refused to be charmed or intimidated by Klaus's severe professionalism. The turning point in the legal battle came when Anna's lawyer instructed her to document everything. Not just the criticisms, but the emotional cost. Anna wrote page after page, not of arguments but of the silence, the isolation, the precise controlling schedules, the rejection of her tastes, her feelings, her very self. The lawyer didn't call it abuse. She called it a pattern of emotional coercion designed to establish financial and psychological dependence, rendering her unable to negotiate freely. This perspective shifted the entire foundation of the case. It took 11 brutal months. Klaus fought over the contents of a cutlery drawer, over a single jointly owned classic car, over the definition of community property. He didn't care about the objects, he cared about the control and the humiliation of Anna. He truly could not fathom that she preferred nothing to him. But Anna had found a new kind of quiet, the quiet focus of a person fighting for their life. She stopped trying to win Klaus's approval or argue his warped logic. She simply fed her lawyer the facts and watched from a safe distance as the structure of his control was legally dismantled. When the papers were finally signed in separate rooms at her insistence, Anna felt nothing but a deep, profound emptiness. It wasn't triumph. It was the exhaustion of surviving a disaster. She was free, but the scars were internal and extensive. Anna moved into a tiny, light-filled studio apartment on the 4th floor of an old building, tucked into a quiet, tree-lined street. The building was old, the floors creaked, and the kitchen was absurdly small. There was even a faint, pleasant smell of dust and old wood. It was glorious. The first few weeks were dominated by paranoia. Every time the phone rang, she flinched, assuming it was Klaus with a final, crushing critique of the divorce settlement or a demand to adjust the mailing list. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like his measured, deliberate footsteps. She found herself cleaning compulsively, straightening picture frames, terrified of the invisible judgment she had lived under for so long. One Sunday morning, 2 months after the divorce, she was making breakfast. She took an egg from the carton, and it slipped from her fingers, splattering onto the pristine white tile floor. A wave of icy dread washed over her. He would call this incompetence. He would make a note of this. He would ask why I couldn't be more careful. She stood frozen, staring at the yolk pooling on the floor. For 15 years, this would have been a 5-minute lecture on her carelessness and the lack of respect for their clean, organized home. Then, she did something revolutionary. She laughed. It was a small, dry sound at first, but it quickly escalated, a real, genuine, belly-shaking laugh of pure absurdity. It was just an egg. No one was watching. No one was judging. There was no consequence but the 10 seconds it took to grab a sponge. She cleaned it up, humming the loud jazz tune she had bought. She decided on the spot that the kitchen needed to look less like a sterile operating room. She went out and bought the most offensively bright, mismatched tea towels she could find, one with screaming yellow lemons, one with giant pink polka dots. She hung them with pride. They clashed terribly with the blue tile, and she loved them for it. Anna started to live alone, and she discovered the delight of solitude. She realized that living alone was not the same as being isolated. Isolation had been Klaus's weapon, a byproduct of his need to eliminate external influences on her. Solitude, however, was a choice, a refuge, and a space for growth. She kept the apartment warm, perhaps too warm, because Klaus had always insisted on efficient, almost chilly temperatures. She started cooking foods that had been forbidden, spicy Indian curry, heavy Italian sauces, anything with too much garlic. The apartment smelled of life, of spices, of her desires. She began to work intensely on her translation projects, but now she worked on her own schedule. She worked in pajamas until noon if she wanted to, then took a long, unstructured walk in the afternoon. She ate when she was hungry, not when the schedule dictated. Without the constant fear of criticism, her focus sharpened, and her income grew steadily. She was, in fact, incredibly competent when she wasn't constantly defending her existence. The true moment of liberation came one afternoon as she arranged a collection of colorful, slightly eccentric pottery she had bought, vases and bowls that Klaus would have sneered at as gaudy clutter. She placed them on a small shelf she had hammered, crookedly, into the wall herself. She looked at the shelf. The bowls were imperfect. The shelf was slightly tilted. The bright colors were distracting, and it was perfectly, wonderfully hers. She realized that the taciturn German man, born in the wreckage of a war that demanded flawless, emotionless order, had tried to replicate that same zero-defect environment in his marriage. He wasn't a monster. He was a broken man who could only feel safe when the world, and especially his wife, reflected his need for total control. Understanding that allowed her to forgive him, not for her sake, but for his. He was still caged by his own crippling ego. She was flying. Anna never remarried. She never sought another partner to fill the space Klaus had evacuated. She had filled it herself. She found a group of new friends, loud, messy artists and philosophers who debated loudly over cheap wine and ate garlic bread without apology. She learned Italian, not because it was useful, but because she loved the sound of it, the expressive hand gestures and the glorious lack of efficiency. Years later, sitting on her sunny balcony, watching the chaotic, beautiful life unfold on the street below, Anna felt the fullness of her own heart. The air she breathed now wasn't just metal and history. It was the rich scent of coffee, old books, and the satisfying aroma of her own, slightly scorched, entirely delicious cooking. She was not a satellite, she was a sun. She had suffered through the winter of his personality, and finally, spectacularly, it was spring. She had found a way to breathe again, and the sound of her own life was the sweetest melody she had ever heard.